So I'm going to talk about a planned way that we're going to use to expose logs from Eiffel activities. So in many cases, your the actors in your CI pipeline would already have already exposed logs. For example, if you're using Jenkins, it already saves the logs. It's not a problem. But there could also be tasks carried out by ancillary services that are run as part of a build or test activity, but they're not run in that same process, or it's run on another machine, accessed through an API. For example, we have hardware labs where we run function tests on devices, and we have various management APIs for interacting with those devices. We don't want to run them in the build process itself, but the logs from those activities would still be interesting to expose in the builds. And those tasks could certainly be modeled using Eiffel activities with context links to the build or test activity. That's not a problem. But how do we expose the logs? So what we currently do in one case is that we have an API endpoint so that the logs from the API service is copied into the log of the parent activity, in this case a Jenkins log. That's of course doable, but there are problems with that approach as well. You could also have each activity store its own logs and serve them through some other endpoint, so that the main log would include a link to the other log. You could also have each activity in each service upload its own logs to some other form of storage, Amazon S3 or Artifactory or something else. None of those approaches are that great because they typically require a fair amount of work in the service itself. And it could be a service that isn't running all the time. So that could be rule out some of those options. So instead, what we suggest is that we already feed all our logs from our services to Elasticsearch. So why not use that? So when we make such a service that's accessed through an API and used by other Eiffel activities, when we make it Eiffel aware, in other words, have it emit activity events, we make sure it includes the activity ID as a discrete log field when it's logging, thereby tagging each log entry with the Eiffel activity that it's part of. Then we can write a service that takes one activity ID as input, searches Elasticsearch or potentially some other service wherever we store logs, and then serves the results to the client. And we'll let the service have a well-defined URL schema, and that way any service that emits activity events and with containing log objects, either live logs or persistent logs, could then include such log URLs in its activity started and activity finished events, like the example at the bottom. And as a bonus, since we're not sort of storing a physical log file in that sense, we can easily serve the logs in any format we like. So with the new media type field that was added or is going to be added in the Lyon edition, we could have different URIs to suit different formats. So a visualization tool like the one Nicholas talked about earlier could choose some representation that's the best for the occasion. So if it's a web app, you might want to pick the text's HTML variant of the log, but if you want to process the log with a script or similar, you would choose the text plain, or maybe if we offer a JSON representation, that's certainly what you would want to choose. So some pros and cons. Well, if we start with the pros, this wouldn't require clients to have direct access to the underlying log data nor access to Kibana. We could still keep logs private if we want. Similarly, we could also filter which log fields are returned to clients. So if we have some fields that contain sensitive information, whatever that might be, we wouldn't have to return those. It will also be very inexpensive to implement for services that already implement activities. And of course, if they are pushing the logs to Elasticsearch. And also live logs and persistent logs, they work just as well both. But there are a few cons as well. It does assume that you are collecting your logs to Elasticsearch, or again, a similar service. I assume if you would use Datadog, for example, it would work. It could work in a similar fashion. On the other hand, you should be collecting your logs, I think. So this could be an incentive to start doing that. It also assumes that you have sufficiently long retention times for your logs. If you currently save your logs for a very short duration, maybe because you have huge volumes of logs and you want to keep the costs down, and you only want to save full logs for, let's say, a week, that's perhaps a bit short time for these kinds of logs. We save our logs for 6 months, so that's certainly sufficiently long. Regardless of how you're saving logs, you're probably going to have some kind of cleanup of old logs. Also, compared to a physical log file, it could be a problem that logs would be displayed out of order, since we are fetching them from essentially a database and relying on timestamps to get them in the right order. The default date type in Elasticsearch indexes only has millisecond precision. So if a service logs a lot of data, you could get them out of order when you retrieve them. There is a new date nanos type that uses nanosecond resolution, so that should help in most cases. So I would expect that we can start implementing this within the next couple of months, I think. Of course, it could be done in a pretty simple manner. I mean, you receive a request, you have one endpoint, and you just search Elasticsearch and mangle the data a little bit. So I don't think we have to make it more complicated than that. And there's no reason for us to keep this closed source. It has nothing to do really with access. So I expect it'll be open sourced. And one of the goals of doing this, connecting back to what Niklas showed earlier, is that we want in the follow my commit view that displays what's going on in the whole pipeline. If there are such side activities taking place during a test or a build, we want those activities to show up in that visualization as well, and for users to be able to look at those logs. So that's one of the reasons that we're interested in this. Yes, questions or comments?
I have some questions. Like when you say logs, like what do you mean logs? Is it like the raw data of all this Eiffel event that you have sent in your CI pipeline, or what kind of information do you have in the logs?
It depends on the activity. If it's a build activity, it would be the build log. In this case, it's side services that perform some kind of task that's sort of done on behalf of the build, but for maybe technical reasons, it's not run in the same process or on the same machine as the actual build. But it could still be very interesting for the initiator of the build to be able to see that log. For example, our builds build firmware for access devices, and we have a service that downloads those firmware images onto the devices using some kind of API to flash them. Sometimes the device, the flash operation itself fails, or the device doesn't start up afterwards. In that case, it's very useful for our developers to be able to see what went on in that service that attempted to flash the device, instead of just getting back, oh, the flashing didn't work, sorry. And they would have to somehow dig up whatever log was being produced. So that's the main goal of it. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. So I assume you're using logstash like to collect all the logs, and then because in Elasticsearch, like usually you need to specify some name field, then you only can store that in Elasticsearch. Then because now you said there's a whole, I was a little bit confused, like when you said the whole logs like stored in Elasticsearch. Do you mean you store the logs into a single field? Because like they also have some limitations on like how much data you can store on each field. If not, like you will not be able to do the filtration as well.
Yeah, I mean, there will be one document in Elasticsearch for each log entry, and
Okay.
We always try to not produce plain text logs, but always use JSON. So you already have the timestamp, the log level, and the message, and so on in discrete fields. And then you would also add the Eiffel activity ID. In other words, the ID of the activity triggered event would be another log field that would end up in the Elasticsearch index. And that way you could easily filter out only the log entries relevant for a particular activity, even though that the process that implements this API could, service multiple requests at the same time.
Okay. Yep. I think I got what you explained. Thank you very much.
I also have a follow-up question there. Have you been thinking about access rules or authorization to access this log data? Because we are actually looking at something similar when we discussed the follow my commit in Ericsson, and we are currently under the idea that we should in a follow my commit GUI or any other GUI, we should mostly provide links to where the logs are stored, and then it's up to those providers of the logs, say some artifact repository or Elasticsearch or whatever, to handle the authorization of the users wanting to access the logs. Is that something you have considered, or do you think everything is open for anyone in Access, for example, that to look at all logs?
No, we would have we would require authorization for this URL here. It would, what we currently have planned is to have the same access rule for everything in this domain, probably. But potentially we could have different rules, and I'm thinking we could have a model where you could the producer of the logs, the activity, the API service in this case, could choose this part of the URL, and this would reference a configuration of the logs serving service, so to speak. So if you would have Eiffel here, you would have one set of access rules. If you have some other string here, it would map to some other configuration that could define other access rules if these logs are extra sensitive, for example, or if they should be public. So it would basically be up to the producer of the events to choose what access level is applicable.
And do you think then that could be mapped to access levels within the GUI where you publish this information as well? So you can like log into the GUI and have different, depending on who logs into the GUI, they can see different parts of this, or will the GUI itself fetch everything and then the GUI user, so to say, or the functional user behind the GUI will need to have the right access? Or
are you thinking of the follow my commit GUI, or?
Yeah, for example.
Yeah. I would imagine that, I mean, at least in our case, I think the follow my commit GUI would have the same access rules as the logs GUI, probably. So, and we would just have the same rules everywhere. So I don't think that would be a problem in our case. But if we would need to have segregated rules, I would expect the GUI to. I suppose I don't know. You could, I mean, it would be, of course, be fancier if the follow my commit GUI would understand that, hey, you don't have you won't have access to these logs, so I'm not even going to show you the logs link. Or it could just ignore the problem and people get a 403 error if they attempt to access it. I mean, depends on if that's a reasonable use case, or if you have access to the follow my commit UI, you're okay to see the logs as well. It depends on the organization. In our case, I say we can have equal access rules.
Can I ask, if we just now we talk about the visualizations, are you guys like using Kibana to do the visualization, or you build up like another GUI just to visualize like your logs files? Because you can use Kibana as well if you want to.
We use Kibana a lot and Grafana also to visualize data.
Okay, so because like I think in Kibana, like you can set like the kind of like the different user level. Then like because I just now like Emil asked like can someone view this one and can someone not viewing that one? You know, like there's some like user role that you can appoint that like you can have the guest role, or you can have like this dashboard for this user group. And so there's some sort, if you're using Kibana, then like there's some sort of thing that already exists, you know, in the Elasticsearch.
Yeah.
So we have just curious. Yeah. Okay.
No, we have a couple of different. We have sort of two tiers of access. One that we call public, which is basically if you work within R&D at Access, you have access to these logs, and then we have logs in private indexes, and then it's only basically only the tools team that has access to it, and it contains, for example, more personally identifiable information, while the public indexes only contain information that's basically public. I mean, all Garrett events, all Jenkins events, those are public anyway, so there's no reason to lock them down. So we have two tiers of access, but I know that during, while we've had that policy, Elasticsearch has become more capable in terms of document level, and I think even field level access control rules. And we could implement such rules, but then things start to get pretty complicated. So at least for now, we're sticking to a rather simple and stupid model, but it's definitely easier to understand. And so far, that's been working pretty okay.